Welcome to the Minimum Viable Product course by the AT&T Agile Center of Excellence. The content of this presentation is adapted from a live MVP workshop. The objectives of this course include the importance of understanding a customer's need, understanding differences between large and small batches and how they affect delivery. What exactly is an MVP, and when or where does it apply? The methods for slicing large features into smaller units of deliverable value, prioritizing work while still responding to the customer's need, defining and applying related terms like epics, leading indicators, and MVPs, and the many faces of an MVP. It's not a one-size-fits-all concept. Before we can define a minimum viable product, we need a business context. We need a product, or at least a request for a product. For the purposes of this course, let's set the context by watching a short video from a customer expressing their pressing business need, and then we'll jump right into our first activity. Okay, we know that was a quick video. And don't worry that you didn't copy down all of the requested app functions. You'll see them again when you need them. So let's take a look at the customer's request. What's the client asking for? Think of the big picture. He's asking for an app with multiple functions. And what's the deadline? Yeah, it's just about the only deadline we ever get. It's immediate. What are the challenges to meeting this customer's request? In the classroom, we get a collection of responses, and they all seem to aggregate around a few. The timeline, of course, the deadline that's necessary for everything to be delivered, the complexity of what's being asked, the disparate functions. How about the availability of the appropriate developers with the skill sets needed? And certainly there are unclear priorities here. How would you prepare your response? We're going to let you think of that a little bit longer because we'll deal with that question later in the course. In a SAFe terminology perspective, SAFe being Scaled Agile Framework, what term can be used to refer to the customer's total request? I know we fall into words like project or product, but in a SAFe context, this is referred to as an epic. The whole product would be, or the whole app would be an epic, and we can break that epic down into smaller pieces of work. It's important at this point, however, to emphasize that this course is not intended to be exclusive to Scaled Agile Framework. So I need to emphasize that MVP and the concept of MVP can be applied to any development effort, whether Waterfall, whether it's within the Scaled Agile Framework, a Waterfall project, or any development effort in between. Before we move into the next topic, let's consider the delivery method that's implied by the client. He's asking for a large amount of work, multiple functionalities, and he wants it all now. This is a classic model for a waterfall development process. All of the design is done up front. All of the development is coded at once before anything is delivered. When you look at a waterfall project and you consider maybe the financials, the full budget for the entire product has to be committed up front. In the flow of work, this is monolithic code. Waterfall is a model in which all development is complete before any delivery is performed. And because of that, morale is low, both on the team side as well as the customer. From a team's perspective, they have a mountain of work. There's no end that's readily in sight. And of course, everything needs to be done now. From a customer's perspective, he's waiting and waiting before he receives any value, knowing that there is a long development cycle. From a value delivery perspective, it is all or nothing. And quality suffers in this environment because there's a lot of code. There's an integration, then we test, and we end up filing back into fix before we can get anything out the door. How can we do this better? How can we break that large monolithic code, or the delivery of large amounts of code, into smaller pieces? That's where the Agile part comes in. We're going to be exploring this further as we talk about MVP, but the benefits of doing this, from a financial perspective, if all that we're focusing on completing is a smaller portion of that solution, then the financial commitment is small up front, followed by incremental spend down the road. The flow, small amounts of work are more easily defined, easier to scope, easier to build, easier to test, faster to deliver. Team morale is high. Not only can they see a light at the end of the tunnel, there are small incremental successes that they get to celebrate. And from the customer's perspective, they're receiving elements of value in much shorter periods of time. So the value delivery is incremental. And the quality is very high. Given the smaller scope of work at any given time, the frequent integrations, the faster feedback from our customer, it enables us with opportunities to course correct based on new information. Course corrections may result in a better and even different solution than originally imagined. Exactly what is an MVP? MVPs are focused on the minimum required functionality that provides value directly or indirectly to a customer or a system. MVPs aren't necessarily partial solutions. What they are is the scope with the smallest set of functionalities that still addresses the need. They support the concept that small batches of work move through a system easier, reducing risk and improving time to market. Now, having mentioned market, it's important to clarify that MVP is sometimes not a deployable product. It's a piece of functionality that's used for learning. The purpose may be only to validate a hypothesis, or just enough to receive customer feedback. Maybe they're scoped with the intention to minimize initial investment and reduce risk. In the classroom, we see a cross-section of people who have or have not participated in a penny game. If you have, please bear with me while we go through a brief summary of how that game is run. Essentially, we break groups up into teams of 4 or 5 people. One of them will be a timer. They won't be involved in flipping any coins. They're there to begin the clock when the first coin is tossed and stop the clock after the last coin is tossed. The rest of the people on the team are representing activities in a process. And the way that the first round is run is that there's a batch of 10 coins. Those 10 coins are delivered to the first activity, the first person on the team. They then have to flip each coin one at a time and record whether it fell heads or tails. And they're going to flip all 10 coins before they've finished that activity, and they push that set of 10 coins over to the next person, the next activity in the process. Whereas activity number 2 is run across all 10 coins, flipping them one coin at a time and recording whether it's heads or tails, and so on. So the batches of 10 coins are processed by each activity before they're pushed to the next activity. What we see when we run the game is that this large batch process, where all 10 coins have to be processed at each activity before they move to the next, is we start seeing teams completing this exercise in about 1:40 to 2 minutes, 20 seconds. So you're seeing about a full minute of variation between fast teams versus the slower teams. This isn't because people don't know how to flip coins. It's just the difference in the way that they perform the work, the efficiency with which they're able to flip and record, how well they're able to pass the work to the next stage, the next activity in the process. That variation is something that ideally we'd like to work out of the process, because this is wasted time. Even within large batch, you can see there's a 60 seconds worth of waste that could have been cut out from slower teams to faster teams. The real benefits is when we start looking at the next phase of the game. And that's where we do what we're calling a small batch. Instead of having to flip all 10 coins before they move from activity 1 to activity 2, They flip one coin, and as soon as they've made that recording, activity 2, the second person, doesn't have to wait for the coin. They pull the coin, and they flip it and record whether they got heads or tails. And person number 3 gets to pull that coin as soon as it's available. So what we're looking at in terms of the graphic that you're seeing in front of you, you're looking at the process of flipping these 10 coins as it's going from activity 1, which is blue, activity 2, which is orange, and activity 3, which is green. The top row is this large batch exercise after 9 coins have been flipped. Activity number 1 has flipped 9 coins, but there's still one more coin waiting to be flipped. No work has been performed in activities 2 or 3 because they're waiting until it's their turn, until that batch of work is transferred to their workstation. On the second row, in that small batch model, 9 coins have also been flipped. But you can see that activity 1, as soon as they flipped the coin, it was pulled by the orange group. The orange person flipped the coin. As soon as that was done, the green activity was able to pull that coin and flip it. So in this case, 2 coins have already made it through all 3 stages. The 10th coin still has not yet been flipped by anyone. But the example here, not only do we see completion times of all 10 coins through all 3 stages drop dramatically to about 40 or 50 seconds total, but the variation between slower teams and faster teams has dropped to as little as 10 seconds as opposed to a full minute in the large batch exercise. Also, a key learning that we discover here in running the penny game is that value isn't delivered to the customer until it has been processed through all 3 activities in this example. And you can see that in the large batch exercise, after 10 coins or even 9 coins have been flipped, no value has exited that green stage. No value has been completed in the green stage. Whereas in small batch, we already have 2 coins that have been completely processed by the green stage and are available, if we were building code, for instance, available for deployment. What does a penny game teach us? As we decrease the batch size, or the scope, in our case from 10 coins to 1, throughput increases, which enables faster value delivery. Referring to the previous MVP definition, our minimum required functionality is flipped coins. By moving faster through all activities, we get them into our customers' hands faster, and that maximizes our learning opportunity. If you're unfamiliar with the penny game and would like to see it in action, there's a link on the last page of this presentation. All products, internal or external, have 4 main qualities. They have to be feasible. That is, I can conceive of it. It has potential. It's got to be valuable. If it exists, then there's value in having it. They must be usable. There's a tangible use for a customer, a user, or a system, and it should be delightful. There must be a differentiator that makes a difference in the marketplace. You may have seen this pyramid that represents the construction of a product or an idea. So this pyramid is kind of general. Let's say that we're building an app. When we think of building solutions, it's easy to think of them in layers, such as architecture, software or data, the user interface, or other connections, and every development effort should always provide some benefit that's not available from other competing solutions. That's the AT&T secret sauce. What could you do if the product seems too big or not feasible? These are opportunities to experiment or investigate, maybe to poll customers, use focus groups, partner with third parties. AT&T does all of these things. In a product environment, we sometimes think of that product from the top down, considering the sauce first, that delighter, and then backing into the solution. This effectively turns a pyramid upside down, which is an unstable solution. This is what happens when we focus too much on the delighter without thinking enough about providing support for the underlying solution. So in this slide, the pyramid represents the whole product, or the epic. Minimum viable products should be thought of in the same way, only smaller and less complex. In the same way as building the full pyramid of our app, the MVP has to contain all of the same qualities. It has to be feasible, it has to be valuable, usable, and delightful to the customer. Remember that your MVP is for a couple of purposes. One could be to minimize the investment or the risk of building this entire monolithic code. It could be to generate a small amount of revenue. it's more than likely to prove out a hypothesis or to provide a learning opportunity so you can get that customer feedback and ensure that what you're delivering is really what the customer wants. If we want to build something small, how do we deliver a working app? This is the reason why an MVP needs to be a vertical slice through all of the horizontal components that make up your app, rather than just delivering one layer. The minimum viable product on the left contains a slice of functionality that includes each of those desired qualities, rather than developing them serially, feasibility first, value second, and so on.
So we just talked about on the previous slide how to slice up functionality vertically to create a value to the customer. So let's look at this slide here where we use an example of a wedding cake. Put yourself in the shoes of a baker, right? How do we give the customer that experience of the wedding cake, what we think they would most likely want, or capture feedback from them to maybe make some changes? So if you look here, we're going to start off our cake looking at 3 components. The cake itself, the filling that we're going to use, and then whatever frosting and decoration is needed to really give that wow to our wedding cake. So how do we, as the baker, give our customer the wedding cake experience without actually creating and going through all of the cost and time associated with actually creating the wedding cake? Again, we're trying to capture their feedback, right? Their take on, do they like the components as we've created them, and what changes would they make? So let's take that cake analogy one step further. We've talked about the 3 components. We've talked about what kind of style cake should we use. Should it be yellow versus chocolate? We talked about the filling. Do we look at fruit versus pudding? Or even the frosting, right? Do we look at cream cheese versus buttercream? These are all potential options that we could share with our customers. So how do we share that opportunity, capture that feedback from the customers without creating full-size wedding cakes? Well, if you look at the lower part of our slide, we talk about that. You could create an MVP. And what would an MVP of a wedding cake look like? Well, it could be a cupcake. We could either share with our customers some ideas that we have of different combinations that would work, or maybe we capture some feedback from them. Maybe we capture what they think they would like, and we turn around and we create cupcakes based on that to capture it. Are they truly getting what they're asking for? If we look at the layer cake, so maybe there's an opportunity. Maybe we think that we've got a great idea, a great combination that we could at some point turn into a full-scale wedding cake as an option. But the reality is we want to get some feedback from a larger group of customers. So maybe we create some layer cakes and we sell those layer cakes, slices of those, to see what that feedback would be. So this slide does a great example, and the wedding cake does a great example of showing us different ways of looking at getting the customer the minimum viable product, that cupcake, that taste, that experience that we want them to have, before going through all the expense, time, and energy in creating a wedding cake as their final solution.
Now, applying the vertical slice of cake analogy to our banking solution, we can think of the whole cake as our banking app and each vertical slice of cake as a consumable function of the app. The horizontal layers of our cake, these are the underlying systems or framework that support the solution. The vertical slices, on the other hand, are consumable functions or features of that solution. Any one of these slices could have been an MVP, with subsequent slices delivered in a later release. If you think about ATMs or banking apps, or just about any technology for that point, this is exactly how solutions are deployed. Consumers receive basic function with features added over time. So now that we know what an MVP is, who defines one? Who creates an MVP? The scope of an MVP is not defined in a vacuum. It's important that business and technology and consumers even, the customer absolutely, collaborate to identify that critical need. The critical need could be a function, a market-driven capability, or an area of discovery you wish to pursue. Without that collaboration, the functionality requested may not be feasible, valuable, usable, delightful to our customers. It's important to note that an MVP can be an architecture item. Customers, after all, can be internal or external. Remember our client from the beginning of the course, Gigantor Bank? We're going to get back to them soon, but before looking more closely at our banking client's request, Let's look at a few real-life MVP examples, as well as methods for dividing large scope into small functional slices of value. Here we see three name brands that you probably recognize: Zappos, Groupon, and Dropbox. These are great examples of well-recognized brands that all began with an MVP. Zappos is an online shoe store. Prior to Zappos' business model, the only way that you could buy shoes was to physically go into a shoe store, try on a pair or as many as you'd like, and then purchase the shoes to take them home. In 1999, founder of Zappos, Nick Swinmurn, he started with an idea that people would buy shoes just by looking at photos on our website. Instead of spending a lot of money to design an online store and gather inventory and set up a customer service organization, Nick took pictures of shoes from local shoe stores in his area. He posted these pictures on his website, and whenever a customer ordered shoes from his site, he went back to the store, purchased the shoes, and packed and shipped the shoes to his customer. Zappos was testing an MVP idea. They had a hypothesis that people would purchase a shoe just from the photo, foregoing the experience of trying them on for the convenience of having them shipped to them. So the Zappos story is starting a business without any product inventory. Let's talk about Groupon. They launched an online service offering without developing any back-end solution. The Groupon idea sprung from organizers of large community activities like meetups. They realized the value in offering meal deals to the participants in their activities. So with a few participating restaurants under their belt, Groupon was built in a month using a WordPress blog with daily deals listed as blog posts. Instead of developing software, the customer support lead would spend 3 hours every afternoon personally emailing Groupon vouchers to each paying customer after the deal's closed. Groupon started with MVP functionality, just a basic set of features, and a manual back end. Dropbox generated a market before they even had a service offering. Dropbox started as a quick solution to sync files across multiple Windows-only devices. The need arose when a developer was traveling for a presentation, realizing that he left his thumb drive behind with everything on it that he needed, and discovered the need to have a solution in place for his own purposes that would replicate his files across any number of his devices. The developer built the first prototype to solve his own file sharing issues. Now, this personal solution might have been able to support 10 to 12 users, but it was Windows only. It wasn't scalable. It certainly did not have a robust security. But before he launched the business or invested any time developing additional features, he needed to know whether or not there was a market for the function that he had just built for himself. So the developer created a video. He recorded the way that the solution worked and narrated the screen capture video from his own laptop. This basic MVP explainer style video, it produced 75,000 pre-release subscriptions overnight. So Dropbox tested the market and received over 75,000 subscriptions before developing the product. So now that you know the MVP story behind three very recognizable brands, let's take a look at 7 different methods of dividing large scope into smaller functional slices of value. And let's tie them back to these 3 examples to see which of these methods may have been used in the creation of their MVP. The number one question before initiating any development effort is, what problem are we trying to solve? To answer that question, product management needs to spend ample time in what's called problem space, exploring and validating customer needs, problems, pains with the current customer experience, and to do this before jumping into the solution space, which is efficiently delivering the next minimum viable set of features. Jumping too quickly into solving the problem before clearly identifying the problem leads to designs that are based on assumptions rather than facts. There are some related and beneficial disciplines of design thinking or lean product management, and in applying those disciplines, not only do you refine the problem to be addressed, but also identify one or many markets and use cases. Dropbox is an example of a problem where the solution addressed a greater audience, a greater need than the original intent. Groupon had a big leap forward in that design thinking or problem space thinking because they already knew how to characterize their initial users. They practically had a captive audience. Okay, now that we have a clear definition of the problem, the next question is, do we know enough? Do we know enough to produce the product that we want? Do we know enough about the customers who are going to be using it? Do we know enough about the scaling or the back-end systems that have to support our solution? This is where we break out our investigating or prototyping muscles. When enough information is not known to make a decision, consider ways to gather that knowledge, to create a separate feature or investigation. Or when is a prototype needed? This is where you use techniques like focus groups to gather information about the market, marketing trials if you have a product that you'd like to test in the waters. Both Zappos and Dropbox kind of used this step. They both exposed their product on the internet to test the waters to find out what type of market response would they get. The next method for identifying vertical slices is don't do it all at once. Bringing back that familiar pyramid in the graphic that shows the vertical slice, this is used again to illustrate breaking down some common underlying architecture or repeatable behaviors or shared services into small, reusable functionality. Business features often rely on the same underlying system behaviors, making the first feature to be implemented look very large and complex. Instead, consider breaking out these common functionalities to simplify the implementation of many business features and minimize risk. In keeping with the just enough practice, all three of our MVP examples apply. For Groupon, their initial deals were just for specific events, specific time frame, specific location. For Zappos, they were marketing only in the beginning before they got anywhere near inventory management. And Dropbox, they had an existing Windows-only solution, which they could roll out on a first-come, first-served basis or some type of controlled rollout across their 75,000 early subscribers at a rate that didn't overwhelm the back end as they scaled that up. The next method is delivering the biggest bang for the buck. And this is looking for that low-hanging fruit or the most desired functionality. Consider the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle that focuses on the popular use cases for the greatest return on investment. The Pareto principle of economics states the observation that most things in life are not distributed evenly, as 20% of the input provides 80% of the output. Therefore, to obtain the biggest bang for the buck, focus on the popular cases, because the edge cases, you may find out that their value is small, or the cost to implement them is high, or that they will really be unused. Scrutinize items that are on your to-do list or in your backlog with effective prioritization, as chances are just a few of the items are truly tied to the important issues. The 80-20 rule suggests we should focus on the few items that will generate the most significant results. Remember that 80% of the benefit will likely come from only 20% of that backlog list. In keeping with the biggest bang for the buck, both Dropbox and Zappos applied this principle. For Dropbox, they already had a file sharing solution for Windows platform, so that was their low-hanging fruit. All they needed to do was to make it multi-user. Multiple OS and multi-languages comes later. For Zappos, their low-hanging fruit was just to allow customers to see shoes, to post pictures online. All of the headaches of inventory management and efficiencies in shipping and logistics, that comes later. So now that we've chosen the work that we're going to do, that slice that we're going to pursue as our minimum viable product, how do we keep it as small as possible? This bullet is to defer options, keeping those options open so that we can plan for variability in the future as we learn enough, so that we're building just enough now and just in time later. When deferring options, you can implement just that minimal, delightful experience. For instance, if the functionality that's requested includes multiple options, separate these options or optional behaviors into unique features that could be added later once that core functionality is delivered. For instance, if you're manufacturing plastic bottles, you need a bottle with a cap, certainly, but do you need to decide up front the cap style, the labels, the color of the bottle? If you're building a vehicle, certainly you need seats, but is it important for your MVP to decide on the upholstery or the shapes of the seats? Maybe just a core basic seat is all that's necessary for that first deployment. When considering the options and what you're going to deploy, we want to make sure that we are meeting that need. We need ways of measuring this, and this is where concepts of leading indicators come in. Leading indicators are measures that predict that you're on the right track for success, before you deliver the product or a business objective. So a leading indicator is something that you're able to measure before. For instance, if your goal is to get to the office at 9 a.m., maybe a leading indicator is whether you get up with your alarm on time and get the kids off to school. This is an objective measure. Or if your goal is to create a blockbuster movie, the indicator could be targeting the content of the movie to the desired demographic. This is more of a subjective measure. Lagging indicators, on the other hand, are metrics that will tell you whether your solution is actually performing at the desired levels after deployment. So this is the result that validates your predicted success. Examples of a lagging indicator include being on time to work. What's that percentage that you've made it to work on time? The revenue targets from your blockbuster movie. Or maybe it's a market adoption rate for the product that you've deployed. But now that we have measures, what do we do if our measures don't measure up? How do you use the information that you gain from leading and lagging indicators? This is where you are able to pivot or persevere. If you find out that you're on the wrong track, if you find out that it's not performing to the level that you had predicted, this is a decision moment. A pivot or persevere moment are indicators. These are facts which tell you whether change is needed. That change could include maybe adjusting your process. On the get to work on time process, maybe you just need to set your alarm 15 minutes earlier in the morning. Or possibly approach it to a different approach to the same goal. Maybe taking the train to avoid uncertain traffic congestion. Let's look at whether our 3 MVP examples applied the defer options principle. We already saw from the 80-20 rule, or the biggest bang for the buck, that both Dropbox and Zappos deferred some options, deferred some enhancements to their product in order to get the product out the door or to test the market. But now let's think about leading indicators, leading and lagging indicators. Zappos certainly used the leading indicator. They needed to have some cooperating retail stores that would allow them to take photos. Without that ability, their business model falls apart. From a lagging indicator perspective, Zappos needed online orders. They could post the pictures. If they were successful at being able to take pictures, their leading indicators were met. But now they needed to wait for online orders to come in. That's a lagging indicator. If no orders came in, that represented a pivot or persevere moment. From Dropbox perspective, they also had a leading indicator, the subscriptions that piled up after the publishing of their explainer video. For Groupon, certainly they had a leading indicator of participating merchants and a lagging indicator of orders coming through. All right, so now that we know enough and are ready to build something, how do we decide what parts of that large pyramid, where do we place that vertical slice? The best approach is to identify the minimum implementation, the way to keep it simple, leaving out bells and whistles, yet still delivering value, without compromising quality or the ability to perform the basic work that your customer is asking for. From a coding perspective, this might be what's referred to as the happy path, with some basic error handling. You don't have to code for all of the typos or error messages that may come from connected systems, but just for that happy path, the path that you're trying to prove will work. Looking at the boxes on the screen, so we're building minimum core functionality. Maybe we're testing a hypothesis, proving out that what we want to build is possible. Or maybe it's an enabler story, something that needs to be built first before the rest of the functionality is even possible. And of course, we can't forget security. If you're going to be deploying something into the wild, you need to have minimum amounts of security involved as well. By now, I'm sure you're getting the hang of applying these principles to our 3 MVP examples. We'll cover this one quickly. For Groupon, their initial implementation was a WordPress blog with manual email. For Zappos, they had photos that they took at local shoe stores, no inventory, and a manual shipping method. In Dropbox, their first release was Windows only, English only. Another way to minimize the scope of work or the amount of investment in an MVP is to deliver incremental use cases. And keep each deliverable increment user-focused, but limited in scope. When multiple use cases are required to deliver the capabilities, you can split each use case into its own feature. Drawing on previous slides, you start with the simplest user interactions that are required to generate the fast feedback. Think of your happy path and collecting that leading indicator type of measurables. Keep each increment user-focused and end-to-end, but limited in scope. You could separate out different user groups or channels or regions or formats individually before adding and supporting others. For instance, consider launching the features just to or for a limited user group, or maybe just for wireless consumers, or in a single geography in one language, or on mobile only. The solution may logically be the same in all cases, but the delivery of the feature on each channel could be rolled out as a different feature within the whole initiative. Applying the use case practice to our 3 MVP examples, for Dropbox, they could apply their same solution to multiple use cases, but they needed to roll it out in a controlled manner. Their first target audience were developers, but it could apply to anyone as we know today. Music lovers who want their music across multiple devices, multiple operating systems, whether it's desktop and mobile, legal practices needing to share files, professionals like you and me. For Zappos, their first use case was a marketing engine in front of other people's inventory. Maybe their second use case was tying online orders to an inventory management solution. And finally, managing their own contracts for shoe inventory so that they could sell them directly. And for Groupon, their first implementation was serving meetup participants at one location at a specific time. Over time, that has grown to the just about anything, anywhere, anytime experience that they offer today. Let's summarize the 7 methods for identifying vertical slices of functionality. Focus on the problem space. This is the design thinking method to clearly define the issue that needs solving. Asking yourself, do we know enough to make a decision? Don't do it all at once, or stated another way, doing just enough to validate your hypothesis. Applying the 80-20 rule, focusing on the few items that generate the most significant result. Defer options, keeping options open and planning for variability. Design for minimum implementation, keeping it simple and leaving out all the bells and whistles. And deliver incremental use cases, keeping each increment user-focused and end-to-end, but limited in scope.
What we normally do in class is a 10-minute exercise. It's a brainstorming exercise where each of the teams work amongst themselves to create examples of how they feel an MVP, a minimum viable product, can be useful to either the team or the customers that they support. Many times what we found is they bring up the examples such as attracting investors. And I think that was kind of shared in the Dropbox example. A lot of times it's used to attract early adapters and generate first learnings. So it's kind of like creating those pilots that we talked about in Groupon. It proves an assumption. So we think we know what the customer might want, but how do we prove that? An MVP is a great tool to utilize and figure out if we've met the mark. Zappos was an example of that as well. We receive feedback. It helps us understand if we're not moving in the right direction. It gives us an early indication we need to pivot, right? We need to pivot without mercy and move forward, go a different route. And it helps us allow to fail early. So we won't spend too much time, energy, resources into a opportunity or a hypothesis that ultimately is going to fail. Again, an MVP is a great way of utilizing these examples. What examples do you have? In this exercise, I want you to reference back to that initial video as you started the workshop. If you remember, we talked about a banking client that was trying to create an app and all of the features that app would contain. In this exercise, we want you to put yourselves in kind of the seat of the product owner. Think about this list that's on the slide, from bill pay all the way to credit report and FICO. If you were trying to work with a client to understand how to prioritize that work, how would you do that? Take a minute, think about that. What tools, what processes, what thoughts might you have as to what's the best way to maneuver that? Here's some ideas. Have you thought about end user desire? How do we know? Maybe there's a survey opportunity we can create. Maybe it's a part of the initial app itself. What about an opinion survey? What about usage patterns? Maybe there's an opportunity to talk to employees like tellers and find out what are those activities that customers of that bank are most asking the tellers to perform. Because if we look at that from a prioritization perspective, maybe we can reduce some of the time that tellers take to complete that work. What about cost of delay? Is there a cost associated with the fact that we don't have that functionality in our initial app? Empirical data. What data is available that can help us understand what's most important or what's least important? And finally, ease of implementation. So it's not always, when you look at prioritization, sometimes is there a balance between being able to get something out there quickly compared to a larger, more complex functionality that might require some more time? What ideas did you come up with? As we finish out the rest of this workshop, be thinking about those opportunities.
In the classroom, we run an activity where the students work together as teams to review their prioritized features, come up with a pitch for the client, and explain to them the pros and cons of the all-or-nothing versus an iterative delivery model. Consider how you'd pitch your solution to the client and its development and deployment plan. For lack of an opportunity to role-play, I'll share the objectives of this exercise. Compare your pitch to the following. We expect that students would inform the client of large batch delivery versus iterative delivery, where Waterfall method could take up to a year to deliver the whole app, versus an Agile delivery with the base functionality in 10 weeks and incremental delivery of remaining features, whatever your prioritization of features would be. So your pitch would go something like, we can certainly build the bank app with all of the bells and whistles that you're asking for, but we want to make sure that we meet your customers' needs. There are two delivery models. The first would be delivering everything at once, the way that you ask for it, with all the functions that you ask for. This will take 10 to 12 months. The second delivery option is more of an agile model, where we deliver the two highest demand functions, the ones that are most important to your customers, maybe the account balance and transaction history, along with a third functionality. This would be a survey feature containing a list of all of the other functions that you are proposing that we add to the app and allowing the users to rank or to select their top two. We'll use the results of that survey to help us prioritize the subsequent releases, which will be driven by customer prioritization.
All right, this next exercise really sets the stage, right, for what we've talked about so far. It really kind of puts everything together about what we've learned. So let's take a look at this example. In this example, we're looking at 3 different progressions of MVP or possible MVP. And that's really the ask, is for you to look at this diagram and tell us, which one of these 3 scenarios do you believe is an MVP? The first scenario, you can see we kind of start off creating a tire or an axle and working our way up through the chassis to the actual vehicle itself. Second scenario, we move from a skateboard to an actual vehicle. And the third scenario, you see we kind of start off with what looks to be a truck, and we work our way to a 4-door SUV. So take a second, look at this, and based on all that we've talked about, which one of these scenarios looks to you to be the most value-added MVP? Now be thinking about this, right, as you look. Here's the scenario. We're a new car company. We haven't been in the market yet, but we're starting to. Second piece of this is, remember exactly what the customer asked. They asked for transformation from point A to point B only. All right, what are your thoughts? We'll share that most students will look at that center scenario, which is the skateboard through the bicycle, progressing up to the motorcycle and into the SUV. Many students will say that that is the best case scenario for an MVP. And rightfully so. You start off as a skateboard. Remember, the customer asked for transportation from point A to point B. A skateboard might very well meet that need, and you never have to go any further. But what we will find is, maybe they try the skateboard, it meets a need, we generate some value, but they come back to us based on some surveys and they say, hey, we need something a little faster. And something a little faster is a bicycle. Again, we are kind of upping our manufacturing game a little bit, putting a little bit more time, effort, and energy into that. But again, not the cost of a motorized vehicle. And you can kind of see the progression from here, again, based on feedback. So most students, again, will pick the second scenario, and rightfully so, as being the best MVP option. But let's talk a little bit about option 1 or option 3. So if we look at option 1, what would be the benefit to that? So we create, even though the customer asks for transportation from point A to point B, we're not going to give them that till the third iteration here, where you kind of see what looks like a convertible. But what if we look at it from a leading indicator perspective? We want to understand pretty early on if we need to move forward with our hypothesis, right, our idea, or do we need to pivot and move away? So what we do in this scenario is maybe we create that axle. And based on that leading indicator, that first chance to understand if we really want to get into the manufacturing world when it comes to a vehicle, we either persevere based on our results, what our indicators tell us, and move forward, or we pivot and go a different route, or maybe decide to move away from that industry altogether. So in this scenario, let's say that we create the axle, we decide we like it, we move forward with the chassis, and subsequently get to the convertible, which again gives the customer that first glance at being able to move from point A to point B. Another benefit of this one could be that maybe we find that we have a market for axles or chassis. So even though we don't actually give our initial customer what they're looking for until the third iteration, maybe there is some financial benefit to us as well in the first and second scenario, doing it this way. All right, let's talk about the third scenario. So again, if you remember, right, when we set the stage here, we are a new company. So for us to go ahead and then create what looks like a pickup truck, that's a lot of overhead up front. If you notice that we've bypassed a lot of opportunity, a lot of feedback, a lot of chance to create something to get the customer from point A to point B in a very low cost model. So if we are, again, a new company, we create this pickup truck, then we've missed the opportunity there. But let's just change the hypothesis a little bit and say that maybe we are a manufacturing company that has already created vehicles. But at this point in time, we've only created pickup trucks. So we can roll out the pickup truck. We've got something that our customers can use to get them from point A to point B. But as they start using it, maybe they start realizing there's some enhancements, some improvements, some new features that are needed. Maybe they want something that can transport their dogs or their family in that is weather controlled. Right? So maybe more like a van or a smaller SUV. So again, this depends on what the actual scenario is. So if you think about it again from we're a new company, probably option 3 is not the best way to go. It's a little bit more expensive on the front end, but if we were an existing company, we definitely could look at this.
We've looked at MVPs from many different angles. As for the key takeaways from this course, we've learned that one of the principles of Agile is the highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of value. And the penny game illustrated that small batches of functionality move through the system easier. They reduce risk and variability, and they improve time to market. So MVP and the concept of MVP enables us to quickly meet the customer's need with minimal initial investment, gather that crucial feedback that enables us to make decisions and pivot, persevere, correct course, followed by iterative solution improvement. So let's wrap up this course with a real AT&T example of how an MVP approach resolved an urgent customer issue. Business Center is building a reusable framework for the onboarding of third-party portals. They were mid-development with the expectation that they would deliver the reusable framework in April of 2019. 7 months before that expected completion, that means September of 2018, the business had an urgent request to onboard a third-party portal. The urgency of this request was due to a compliance requirement that the portal must meet by January of 2019. Problem is that the Business Center solution wouldn't be available until April of 2019. So the first option they explored was, what if we brought in additional developers, accelerated development of the pieces of function that would be delayed beyond January? Yes, it's possible. Yes, it's feasible. It could be done. But pulling that development ahead would add $1 million to the cost of the project. The second option was a manual onboarding of this portal, just doing it brute force, getting them online, getting them into the Business Center framework by January and meeting the compliance requirement, That comes with a $300K price tag. The third option would be to wait, to defer compliance if that were possible, and take advantage of the reusable framework as designed in April of 2019. The benefit of doing that is that the price tag of onboarding in April, once that reusable framework is available, is only $25K. So the business went back to the customer, evaluated the compliance requirements, and the choice was that manual solution. The manual solution best models an MVP in this case, where they took the minimum functionality required to meet the need. It was a scaled down version with very little automation, but it would get the third-party portal onboarded by the compliance deadline. The business ultimately chose the manual solution, the MVP implementation of this solution. This example underscores the fact that MVP applies not only at the beginning of product development, but can be leveraged at any point within the life cycle of the product.
So, to wrap things up, let's review the course objectives and your newly acquired Lean Agile knowledge. You should now be able to describe the importance of understanding the customer's need and how the voice of the customer is integrated into the very fabric of Agile teams. To explain the difference between large and small batches and how smaller batch sizes reduce variability and increase flow. To define what an MVP is and how using MVPs minimizes initial investment, validates product hypotheses, and reduces production risk. You can lead product management through deconstructing large features into discrete vertical slices of functionality that are more easily defined and delivered. Objectively prioritize the customer's or client's need, and clearly articulate the relationship between epics, leading indicators, and MVPs in a safe or scaled Agile framework context. And recognize that there is no one way in defining an MVP, because it depends on the business objective or hypothesis that you're solving for. On behalf of the AT&T Agile Center of Excellence, thank you for completing this workshop. For more information about the Agile COE, or to continue your safe journey, we recommend these resource links. Have a safe journey.